It's been 37 years since the Black Ridge Fire, and there isn't a single day I don't taste the ash on the back of my tongue. I survived the unthinkable. I walked out of a furnace that consumed everything, steel, rock, history, yet I carried no burns, just a terrifying secret that has kept me awake, isolated, and forever looking over my shoulder. They said it was a miracle, a fluke of the wind, or maybe just sheer stubborn luck. They were wrong. Luck doesn't carry a 200-pound man through a wall of flame and smoke so thick the sky disappears. Something else did. Something ancient and colossal. Something that never should have seen the light of day. And I owe it my life, which is why I've never told a soul until now. If I told you the truth, you wouldn't believe me. No one ever has. Before we begin, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. My name is Jack Thorne. I was a hotshot firefighter, part of the elite crews they parachute into hell when the ground teams can't get close enough. We were the last line of defense against the forest turning into tinderboxes. For 12 years, from the time I was 22 until that fateful September, the smell of diesel and scorched pine was my perfume. My office was the unforgiving edge of the wilderness, usually the steep, unforgiving slopes of the Pacific Northwest, where the old-growth timber held onto secrets the way a cedar holds onto moisture, stubbornly and permanently. We weren't cowboys. We were precision tools. We lived by routine, the weight of the Nomex, the scratchy wool blankets in the back of the crew buggy, the repetitive rasp of the chainsaws, the sound of the pumps struggling for water in dry creek beds. The camaraderie was everything. We saw things together, raw, terrifying things that civilians could never fathom. And we never talked about them. Not really. The trauma was just the price of the paycheck. I had been running on borrowed time long before the Black Ridge Fire started. 2 years prior, my partner Mike was caught in a flashover near the Klamath River. We were cutting a fire line. The wind shifted faster than the sensors predicted, and in the space of 3 breaths, the small controlled burn became a roaring beast. I saw him go down. I heard the scream through the static of the radio and the roar of the fire. I got out. He didn't. That loss didn't make me quit. It made me reckless. It stripped away the last layer of healthy fear. I started chasing the flames, not just containing them. I worked double shifts, volunteered for the worst assignments, and actively sought the deepest, loneliest burns. I wanted the forest to take me, maybe, to balance the scales. I wasn't suicidal, but I certainly wasn't careful anymore. The crew knew it. My foreman, a gruff old-timer named Dale, tried to sit me down, told me I was riding the edge too hard. I just shrugged and packed my bag. The woods were easier than facing my empty trailer in the silence where Mike's laugh used to be. The Black Ridge burn began deceptively. It was late summer. The humidity was practically non-existent and the forest floor was bone dry. The initial reports suggested a standard lightning strike fire, maybe 400 acres, remote enough that they decided to send us in for suppression before deploying air support. We dropped in low, the jump successful, landing amidst a relatively sparse area of Douglas fir. The objective was simple: cut a robust line downhill to meet the natural rock scree, starve the fire of fuel before it hit the high timber. We had 4 hours of hard, brutal work under an already hazy sky. The heat wasn't just coming from the fire. It was radiating from the very ground, trapped beneath a suffocating blanket of smoke that seemed to press down on our helmets. Everything was muted. The usual chatter of birds, the rustle of small animals, gone. The silence was the first sign that this fire was different. Wildfires are deafening, yes, but they have a soundtrack of crackling, snapping wood, the roar of updraft, the whine of the saws. Here, the immediate forest around us was unnaturally, deeply silent. It felt like walking through cotton wool, the only sound the heavy, rhythmic labor of our own breathing inside the masks. And then there was the smell. It wasn't just smoke and burnt cellulose. That's a common smell. It's the smell of work. This was something else layered underneath. It was a thick, wet musk, like rotting meat and unwashed fur mixed with something sharply metallic, almost acidic. It was cloying, invasive, clinging to the inside of my mask filter, It was the smell of a very large, stressed animal, but amplified, ancient. I kept running the filter check, thinking the intense heat was messing with my senses, causing hallucinations of odor. I asked the guy next to me, Marty, a younger guy still trying to prove himself. "Marty, do you smell that?" I yelled over the saw, pointing to my nose. He paused, pulled his mask away slightly, sniffed the stagnant air and shook his head, looking worried. "Just the burn, Jack, you okay? We're pushing hard." But I wasn't imagining it. That smell came and went, a ghost note in the oppressive symphony of the blaze. It was strongest not near the main fire front, but strangely, back toward the untouched dark tree line where we had established our initial staging point. It suggested something was already there, moving parallel to us, using the smoke cover as its own personal screen. The forest itself started feeling wrong too. We were clearing dense undergrowth, but certain trees seemed damaged in peculiar ways. I noticed several older saplings, thick enough to withstand low-intensity heat, snapped clean off, not burned through, and not snapped by wind either. They were broken about 9 feet up, the wood splintered sharply, almost like a massive arm had swiped them aside. I tried to dismiss it as falling debris from above, but the break pattern was wrong for that. It lacked the jagged tear of a branch falling. This looked like a violent horizontal force. Marty noticed the tracks first. We were near a small, damp patch of earth where a seasonal spring had dried up. He called me over, his voice low and tight on the radio. "Jack, look at this. Bear, maybe?" I knelt down, pulling off my gloves to feel the impression. It was huge, easily 18 inches long, broader than my chest. It wasn't a bear print. Bear tracks showed defined claws and a distinct heel pad. This was flatter, broader, almost ridiculously human-like in structure, but scaled up beyond any known terrestrial animal. The stride length, where the creature's heel hit the ground next, was enormous, maybe 6 feet. Whatever made this was walking, not running, and it was impossibly heavy. The mud was pressed down into compact clay. I felt that old instinct, the one that had been drowned out by grief and recklessness, scream back to life. It was a cold spike of dread hitting the base of my skull. It wasn't fear of the fire. I knew the fire. This was fear of the unknown predator, the ancient resident of these woods that the fire was now exposing. "Take a picture, Marty. Don't touch anything," I instructed, my voice surprisingly steady despite the rapid thump in my chest. "We keep moving. Doesn't matter what it is, we gotta secure this line before that wind hits." I was trying to sound rational, but the sight of those tracks changed the nature of the entire operation. We weren't just fighting a wildfire anymore. We were trespassing on dangerous ground, and the fire was drawing a monstrous curtain around us. Then the wind hit. It didn't ease in. It slammed us sideways like a physical fist. The air went from stagnant heat to a howling furnace in less than a minute. The fire front, which had been a relatively polite monster 500 yards away, instantly became a roaring, incandescent inferno charging uphill directly towards our line. The temperature spike was immediate and terrifying. I felt the sweat freeze on my skin before vaporizing, and the canvas of my gear felt suddenly thin and useless. Dale, the foreman, was screaming over the radio, his voice cracking with urgency. "Jack, abort! Abort the line! We have a 40-mile-an-hour eastern column bearing down. Get to the black! Get to the burn zone, now!" But we were still on the high, thick timber side. The closest black, the safely charred ground, was half a mile back, directly through the path of the oncoming crown fire. The crown fire is what separates the men from the dead, when the flames leap from treetop to treetop, moving at impossible speed, consuming oxygen so fast it creates its own violent weather. I looked at Marty and the 3 other crew members. They were terrified, frozen for a crucial second, trying to decide between scrambling downhill into the thicket or running uphill toward the already roaring dragon. "Downhill! Everyone to the scree!" I roared, pointing toward the rocky slope we'd been aiming for. It was our only chance for a natural fire break, maybe 150 yards away. Marty was lagging, panicking. He dropped his saw, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at the wall of orange and black smoke that was now swallowing the horizon. "It's too fast, Jack," he screamed. dropping his helmet and clawing at his mask. "We can't make it." The forest was screaming now. It wasn't the sound of fire. It was the sound of the air being sucked out of existence, the roar of thousand-year-old trees exploding like fireworks. "You move, Marty. Move now." I grabbed him, shoving him roughly, forcing him to run. We took the downhill path, a desperate, clumsy scramble through the brush, but the fire was faster. The flames jumped the initial undergrowth, and then, with a horrifying rush, the tops of the firs above us began to ignite. The air was raining burning embers the size of fists. I watched a patch of earth 10 feet in front of me spontaneously combust. We lost Danny almost immediately. He stumbled on a root, fell, and before he could get up, the fire swept over the area where he lay. There was no time to help. There was only the imperative to survive. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We reached the scree, a steep, rocky ravine. It offered meager protection, less fuel, but nowhere to run. The fire was closing in from 3 sides, circling us like a pack of wolves. I realized the wind shift hadn't just changed the direction, it had trapped us in a pocket. I pushed the remaining 2 crewmen, including Marty, into a shallow indent beneath an overhang of basalt rock. "Stay low, get your shelters deployed." The fire shelters, aluminum-coated foil tents, are a last resort. They buy you minutes, maybe seconds, inside a superheated environment, reflecting radiative heat. They are where you go to die if the fire is angry enough. My mind was still clinging to Mike's death. I will not lose another man. I looked up. The sky was gone, replaced by thick, swirling smoke the color of wet charcoal, shot through with violent, blinding streaks of orange light. The heat was unbearable, the skin tightening painfully on my face despite the protection of the gear. "I'm going to try and flank it, see if I can direct the flow slightly." I lied. I wasn't going to flank anything. The fire was 50 feet away, a coherent wall of pure destruction. I was going out to meet it, to buy them 5 more minutes. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on the terrified faces of my crew and charged toward the nearest flank of the inferno. Chainsaws useless, only my Pulaski tool in hand. My adrenaline was a dull, thumping roar in my ears. This was the moment. The fire was going to take me, just as it had taken Mike. I felt a weird sense of calm as I accepted the inevitable. I walked into the smoke, into the noise, into the absolute, overwhelming heat. The heat was an immediate, blinding pain. It didn't just burn, it desiccated. It sucked the moisture from my eyes, nose, and lungs. The smoke was a suffocating physical presence, so dense I couldn't see my own feet. I was lost instantly in a swirling vortex of ash and flame. I hit the ground, coughing violently, the air filter useless against this level of particulates. My lungs seized up. I tasted raw soot and bitter chemicals. I knew I had seconds left before the radiant heat cooked me alive from the outside. I curled up, gripping the Pulaski, trying futilely to cover my neck, my vision swimming in the oppressive blackness interspersed with flashes of intense orange. I could hear the fire right next to me, a snarling, hungry beast. I resigned myself. This is it. I'm sorry, Mike. And then, everything changed. The sound of the fire, the immense, vibrating roar that had been crushing my skull, suddenly seemed to recede, as if a massive, unseen acoustic curtain had been drawn between me and the blaze, and the smell returned. That musk, that rotten, acidic, powerful scent of something huge and wild, was overwhelming, blotting out the smell of burning wood and diesel. It was right next to me. I tried to turn my head, but I was too weak, too close to unconsciousness from the smoke inhalation. I felt something massive and incredibly dense approach through the swirling ash. It was too tall to be a bear and too heavy. The ground shook slightly with its footfalls, muffled by the ash but undeniable. It was not a charging animal. It moved with purpose, with measured power. I felt a sudden, profound drop in the oppressive ambient heat around my body, a localized shield of cool air pushing the inferno back. It was brief, unnatural, impossible. And then I felt it. A touch. It wasn't a tentative or playful touch. It was a massive grip, warm and incredibly strong, closing around the front of my harness. I was lifted effortlessly, yanked off the ground as if I weighed nothing. My head lolled back. I saw, for a split second through the haze, the impossible length of an arm, covered in dark, matted hair, and the sheer breadth of the shoulder rising into the smoky gloom. I remember thinking, with the last vestige of rational thought, no bear is this tall, no man is this strong. I was being carried, not dragged. Carried upright, cradled almost, moving through the thickest part of the smoke, directly toward the inferno, yet somehow, the flames parted for us. I was helpless, a doll in the grip of something ancient, vast, and terrifyingly alive. The fear was complete, paralyzing. I could only gasp, uselessly, as the ground disappeared beneath me and the smoke became my world. The last thing I registered before fading entirely was the feeling of being pressed against rough, warm fur, and the overwhelming certainty that this creature, whatever it was moving with a speed and direction that defied the chaos of the fire. It was navigating the blaze as if it owned the wilderness, and I was just cargo. I didn't know if I was being saved or taken. It's been 40 years and the forest still knows my name. I should have died that night. Something else chose otherwise. If I told you the truth, you wouldn't believe me. No one ever has. Before we begin, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. The Black Hills were never forgiving, but they were honest. You put in the work, you got the peace. That was the trade-off. For 20 years, that was my sanctuary and my battlefield. I was 37 then, too old to be pulling double shifts fighting spot fires, too young to be retired and watching the smoke from a rocking chair. The job had cost me everything worthwhile: the mortgage, the dog, the marriage to Sarah. She said I was married to the trees, that the smell of smoke and kerosene was more appealing than her perfume. She wasn't wrong. I couldn't argue with her. The solitude of the lookout tower, the heavy weight of the axe in my hands, the brutal camaraderie with the hotshots, that was my structure, my addiction. I thrived on the routine of emergency, the mundane stretches of checking equipment, clearing fire lines, and then the sudden, terrifying rush when the radio squawked and the world turned orange. That cycle was predictable. Life wasn't. We were operating out of the old ranger station, 14 miles up from the Highway 87 junction. It was dry that summer, drier than anyone could remember. The needles on the ponderosa pines were brittle, snapping underfoot like glass, and the heat shimmered off the asphalt even at 4 in the morning. We knew it was coming. Every breath you took tasted like dust and impending doom. My partner at the time was a kid named Reyes, fresh out of college, full of fire, ironically, and too eager to prove himself. He reminded me of myself 20 years prior, before the cynicism set in, before the weight of all the near misses started settling in your bones like damp cold. We were patrolling the west perimeter doing mop-up on a 2-day-old burn when the call came in. It wasn't the usual crackle of static and hurried coordinates. This was a scream of urgency, clipped and broken by the wind. They said it was a crown fire, jumping from treetop to treetop, moving at 60 miles an hour down the canyon pass. It had started small, maybe an illegal campfire or a lightning strike, but the wind had grabbed it, turning it into a monstrous, hungry thing in less than an hour. The sound of a crown fire is unlike anything else. It doesn't roar, it screams. It's a sustained, powerful shriek of combustion and wind shear, the sound of millions of tons of superheated air being displaced. It is the sound of nature tearing itself apart. We dropped our gear and drove the brush truck, a sputtering, half-dead old International, towards the plume. Even from miles away, the sky looked wrong. Not gray, but the color of oxidized copper and spoiled milk, illuminated from below by an infernal pulsing red. The air pressure was already dropping dramatically, pulling the moisture right out of your skin, leaving your lips cracked and your eyes stinging. As we got closer, Reyes was silent. He wasn't scared. He was stunned. The sheer scale of it paralyzes you. We pulled into the staging area, or what was supposed to be the staging area, and found chaos. Crew chiefs yelling into useless radios, engines bogged down in the loose earth, and the fire line collapsing almost before it was established. Captain Dale assigned us to a desperate, insane flank maneuver. We were supposed to cut a contingency line far to the south, protecting an isolated cluster of cabins. The odds were against us, but that's the job. You fight the fire not where it is, but where it's going. We drove for what felt like an eternity, the truck bouncing over the logging roads. The smoke was so thick now it filtered the light into a sickly, deep orange twilight. It was hot, unbearably so, even with the windows rolled up. And then, the wind shifted. This was the trigger event, the turning point where the routine emergency mutated into a primal nightmare. The wind had been pushing the fire northeast, right? Giving us the southern flank to work with. But suddenly, abruptly, without warning, the entire atmospheric system seemed to hiccup and reverse course. A massive hot blast hit us from the west. A physical slap that rocked the heavy truck. "Did you feel that, Reyes?" I remember shouting over the engine's strained groan. "Yeah, Ben. It's changing direction. We gotta turn around." I slammed on the brakes. The new wind wasn't a pleasant breeze. It was a convection current, a suffocating vacuum created by the fire itself, dragging the oxygen out of the surrounding air and pulling the inferno toward us like a hungry magnet. The fire wasn't advancing. It was sprinting. I tried to radio Dale, but the airwaves were dead. Just static, hissing and popping like hot grease. The main ridge of the fire, which had been miles away, now seemed to be directly cresting the nearest hill. The trees began to explode. Not burn, explode, as the sap inside instantly vaporized, turning them into pillars of instant screaming flame. I had survived close calls before. I had seen structures vaporize. But this fire had a speed, a malice, I had never witnessed. It was too fast, too aggressive, operating outside the normal parameters of fuel and humidity. Reyes, we're cutting bait. We're heading for the creek bed. Now. I threw the truck into reverse, spinning the tires wildly, trying to turn the heavy rig around on the narrow dirt track. That's when we hit the patch of soft earth. The rear wheels dug in instantly. We were stuck, dead still. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the adrenaline haze. I killed the engine. The resulting silence, only for a split second before the fire's own roaring took over, was deafening. "Get the shovels, we dig!" I yelled. We scrambled out, the heat hitting us like a furnace door opening. It was instantly debilitating. The smoke was no longer thin and irritating. It was oily, thick, and suffocating. It smelled like burning chemicals, like melting plastic and roasted flesh. Combined with the overwhelmingly pungent, sweet odor of burning pine resin, we tried to dig the truck out, frantic, throwing dirt, but the ground was too loose. Within 2 minutes, the visible front of the fire had rounded the bend. It was a wall of pure, vibrating red, 50 feet high, topped by a churning, dark black cloud that reached the heavens. The sound was impossible, a physical hammering against my eardrums. "It's too close, Ben. We can't," Reyes screamed, his voice thin and panicked. I looked at the map, my mind racing. The creek bed was maybe 200 yards through the thick scrub. Our only chance was to ditch the heavy gear and run for the water, but the fire was already closing the angle. "Grab the survival packs and the fire shelters, that's it, everything else stays." We grabbed the aluminum foil bundles, the last resort. The fire shelter is a pitiful thing. A thin shroud of reflective material meant to keep the initial heat burst off you long enough to survive the direct passage of the flame. It buys you seconds, maybe a minute, if you're lucky, and the terrain is favorable. We started running, plunging into the thicket, but the air quality was already impossible. My lungs burned with every shallow gasp. It was like breathing molten copper dust. And then as we ran, the first strange sensory clue hit me. It wasn't the heat, or the smoke, or the terror. It was the smell. Over the stench of burning timber, diesel, and my own fear sweat, there was something else. A deep, muskier odor, organic and profound, completely out of place. It was like wet, fermented earth, strong ammonia, and the overpowering sweet scent of crushed elderberries left out in the sun. It was the smell of something massive, something animal, something that had been in this spot just moments before the world began to burn. Reyes didn't notice it. He was focused on survival, panting hysterically, tripping over roots. He was pure panic. But I froze for a fraction of a second, inhaling that strange, alien scent. It cut through the chemical haze of the fire, clear and unnerving. It was ancient. It was the smell of the forest, yes, but condensed, concentrated, carried on the heat wave in a way that defied physics. It didn't make sense. Everything within 100 yards should have smelled only of pure combustion. "Keep moving, Ben," Reyes screamed, already pulling ahead. We reached a small clearing only to realize the creek bed was further than I remembered. And that's when the second disturbance happened, breaking the natural chaos of the firestorm. I was focusing entirely on my feet, counting steps, conserving oxygen, trying to fight the disorientation that comes from heat exhaustion. I glanced up, scanning the ridgeline that was now completely consumed by the flames, looking for a break in the trees, a landmark. And amidst the impossibly thick, rolling black smoke, I saw movement. It wasn't the frantic scampering of deer or rabbits fleeing the blaze. Those animals were long gone or already consumed. This was slow, deliberate, heavy movement. A shadow, but a shadow with mass. Moving laterally along the ridgeline, perfectly framed against the orange-red inferno. It was taller than any human, taller than the tallest firefighter I'd ever known, even allowing for the heat distortion. It moved like a biped, but with a fluid, powerful gait that seemed indifferent to the uneven terrain and the insane heat radiating off the fire's edge. I stopped dead. Reyes, now 20 feet ahead of me, didn't notice I had paused. He was running flat out, desperately focused on reaching the assumed safety of the water. My heart didn't just pound, it twisted in my chest. That movement was too controlled, too large, too close to the sheer intensity of the flame front. A bear wouldn't walk like that. No animal would be so calm, so exposed, so utterly massive, right on the precipice of the blaze. I squinted, tearing up from the smoke, trying to force my eyes to resolve the image. The light was tricky, dancing and wavering, but the silhouette remained. It was broad across the shoulders, and its head seemed to merge seamlessly with the body, lacking a defined neck. It paused, just for a moment, on the highest point of the ridge, and seemed to look down, directly at me. Then, the true horror hit. The fire, the relentless driving wind that had been pushing the flames toward us, suddenly seemed to split. It didn't die down. It didn't slow. It moved around that figure. It was a momentary, impossible visual effect. The wall of fire, this massive consuming thing, seemed to hit an invisible barrier where the shadow stood. The smoke swirled violently, creating a terrifying cone of empty air around the figure, before resuming its furious drive past it. It was like watching a massive river divide to flow around a stationary, immovable island. My survival instinct, honed over 2 decades of fighting nature's fury, screamed at me to run faster than I ever had. But another deeper, colder instinct rooted me to the spot. My breath caught, lodged in my throat. The creature, the shadow, whatever it was defying the rules of this terrifying environment. It was standing calm in the epicenter of the destruction we were desperately fleeing. And then, as suddenly as I saw it, the air pocket collapsed. The shadow disappeared, swallowed entirely by a fresh rolling bank of oily, suffocating smoke that descended on the clearing like a curtain falling. I barely registered Reyes's terrified scream up ahead, just before he vanished behind a dense pocket of scrub brush. I was alone. The wall of fire was now 30 yards away, its heat radiating at a level that felt like my clothing was about to ignite spontaneously. The roaring was no longer outside me. It was inside my head, rattling my teeth. I had missed my window. I had hesitated for that impossible sight on the ridge, and now, the fire had cut me off from Reyes and from the theoretical safety of the creek. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was going to die here. The air was gone. My lungs were seizing. I fumbled frantically with the fire shelter, tearing at the sealed packaging with trembling, sweat-slicked fingers. I managed to pull the silver blanket out, shaking it open, but the heat was already too much. It felt like being immersed in boiling oil. I dropped to my knees, scraping the bare earth desperately, trying to clear a spot that might offer a fraction of protection, but the flames were already licking at the low branches 10 yards away. My vision started to tunnel. The edges turned black. The sounds became muted and watery, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I wrestled with the metallic shroud, trying to crawl inside, but my coordination was gone. I was hyperventilating, drowning in the carbon monoxide, accepting the inevitable. I remember thinking of Sarah. I remember thinking how stupid it was to die here, in the dirt, consumed by the very thing I had spent my life trying to control. I closed my eyes, the heat intense enough to burn my eyelids, and I curled up, pressing the foil shelter weakly over my head. The smell, that strange, potent, musky, sweet smell, returned, overwhelmingly strong, cutting through the final lethal wave of smoke. It was right here, right on top of me. I tried to gasp, but all I inhaled was hot ash. I felt a tremendous, heavy presence settle beside me, blocking the immediate searing blast of radiant heat. And then, before the blackness completely consumed my consciousness, I felt a hand. Not a paw, not a claw, but a gigantic, powerful hand, rough as bark and hot as the surrounding air, grasped me firmly around the chest. There was no time for fear, only shock, followed instantly by the total void of unconsciousness. But the last thing I remember, the final sensory detail before the world went dark and the fire roared over my position, was the distinct, incredibly heavy, rhythmic sound of movement. Not running, but walking, steady, determined, powerful steps, carrying me away from the sound of the ultimate, consuming destruction. And the pervasive, impossible smell of rain and wet fur, somehow present in the middle of a screaming, desiccated inferno. I was being moved. By something that should not exist. By something the fire respected. And then, nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. The hospital room was sterile, antiseptic, the very opposite of the black, smoking hell I'd been pulled from. But the sterile air did nothing to cleanse the memory trapped inside my lungs. That heavy, sickening aroma of burnt pine, melted plastic, and human sweat mixed with something else. Something deep, earthy, and musky, like ancient wet fur and cold stone. That smell was the only thing that felt real. Everything else was filtered through a haze of morphine and disbelief. They told me I was a miracle. They used that word incessantly. Miracle. The papers called me the Phoenix Firefighter, a man who walked out of an inferno where 3 others had been engulfed. They didn't understand. I didn't walk out. I was placed. The chief came in, tired, his eyes redder than the fire lines. He talked about equipment failure, about the wind shifts, about how they found my helmet 50 feet from where the rest of the crew was lost, and then nothing until I was located almost a quarter mile away, beyond the secondary fire break line, in a section of scrub oak that hadn't even started to crown yet. He shook his head. He kept saying, "We can't explain the trajectory, son, it's like you flew." I couldn't tell him about the weight, the pressure against my ribcage, that feeling of being cradled, not dragged, not carried carelessly over a shoulder, but cradled, like a massive, clumsy father moving a sleeping child. It was too fast, too efficient, and through the haze of smoke inhalation and rising delirium, I remember the feeling of immense heat to my right, and cool, almost damp air surrounding me from the left, along with that penetrating, unfamiliar musk. As soon as I could stand, the guilt became a physical cage. Why me? Why did I survive when Ray, Mitch, and little Jamie, fresh out of the academy, were vaporized? The only way to silence the guilt was to find the truth, to quantify the impossible. I ignored the doctor's orders, signed myself out against medical advice, and used my remaining pull with the Forest Service to gain access back to the burn site. The landscape was apocalyptic, black, silent, and hot even weeks later. It looked like the surface of the moon, dusted with fine white ash. The air was dead. There were no birds, no small creatures burrowing, just silence broken only by the crunch of my own boots on the charcoal earth. This was where the official explanation crumbled, layer by calculated layer. The first piece of evidence was the path. My team went down in a dense thicket of spruce, a section known for wicking, where the fire climbs the trees like a chimney. When they found me, I was a good 5-minute hard run away, crossing a boulder field and a dry creek bed that should have been impassable for an injured, hallucinating man wearing 40 pounds of melted gear. We started at the spot where my helmet was found. It was scorched, melted plastic dripping down the side, definitive proof I was there when the fire intensified. But tracing a line from that point to where I woke up was like trying to draw a straight line through shattered glass. The first prints we found were ours, the recovery team's, heavy boot marks sinking into the ash. But under a rock overhang shielded from the worst of the heat, the lead investigator, a man named Henderson, stopped short. He knelt down, brushing away the fine powder carefully. "Jesus, Mike," he muttered, his voice unnaturally quiet. "Look at this." There, perfectly preserved in the fine, dark soil before the ash layer became too thick, were tracks. They were not human, not bear. A bear walks on the ball and pads, heavy and splayed. These were long, flat, profoundly deep impressions, heel to toe, massive enough that Henderson, a man who wore size 13 boots, could fit his entire foot inside the impression with room to spare. The stride length was the shocker. "This stride," Henderson whispered, pulling out his measuring tape, a professional calculation masking genuine dread. "It's over 6 feet. Running stride for a human is maybe 4.5, 5 max, and look at the depth. Whatever made this was carrying enormous weight, moving fast, and didn't stumble once on this scree." I immediately pointed out the key detail. It's balanced, no drag marks, no scuffing that suggests an unstable load. If I was dragged, my gear, my boots, would have churned the earth. I was lifted. The tracks, Henderson noted, appeared to be bipedal, and what looked like a wide, massive forefoot lacked the distinct separation of toes you see in primate tracks. They were primal, yet impossibly efficient. They didn't sink deeper in the softest parts. They seemed to have been placed with deliberate, intelligent care, almost testing the ground before bearing full weight. This was the second layer of the reveal. Physical evidence that defied gravity, biomechanics, and the rules of thermodynamics. Whoever or whatever moved me was strong enough to navigate a hellscape without breaking stride, and intelligent enough to choose the safest, quickest path. Henderson, a career skeptic, tried to dismiss it as a localized thermal distortion. Maybe the heat caused the ash to compact strangely. Maybe a large mountain lion, briefly standing upright, confused us. But even he looked sickened by his own suggestions. He took photos, meticulously cataloging the site. But I knew what the official report would say. The official explanation, Layer E, arrived 3 days later. Neat, clean, and utterly false. The chief of operations, under pressure from the regional board, ruled the footprints inconclusive. Likely an unknown large predator, perhaps a bear confused by the fire and moving erratically, amplified by the soil composition after the heavy burning. The depth suggests high velocity, not necessarily high weight. They insisted my survival was a result of 2 factors. First, an adrenaline-fueled dash during a moment of extreme clarity, followed by immediate unconsciousness due to hypoxia, which placed me in a sort of suspended animation until the paramedics found me. They cited rare cases of human survival in extreme conditions, focusing on the indomitable will. Second, the firebreak zone. They claimed that the natural formation of the scrub oak, combined with a fortuitous backdraft, created a localized zone of reduced temperature just long enough for me to crawl into it before passing out. This explanation was mathematically and physically ridiculous, and I spent hours dissecting it in the privacy of my small rented apartment, the walls lined with topographical maps of the burn site. The scrub oak was on a higher elevation, meaning I would have had to crawl uphill across jagged terrain. My body scans showed serious lacerations and burns. Yes, but crucially, they showed no defensive wounds on my hands or knees. the kind of abrasion you'd get from desperate crawling. The burns were mostly concentrated on my back and right side, consistent with facing the fire as I retreated, but my left side, the side facing away from the worst of the inferno, was surprisingly intact. More damning was the detail of my equipment. When I was found, my heavy-duty fire axe, which I had definitely been carrying, and which should have been dropped yards away, was lying neatly beside me. My radio pack, slightly melted but functional, was resting on my chest. If I had crawled and collapsed, that axe would have been buried in the dirt, the strap on the radio pack twisted or broken. Instead, they were placed, almost tenderly. This spoke to the third layer of the reveal, D3, behavioral signs, intentionality and care. A bear doesn't gently lay down equipment. A hallucinating man doesn't have the clarity to organize his tools before succumbing to smoke inhalation. Something had treated my unconscious form with respect, almost reverence. I remembered the brief glimpse of motion through the thick, choking smoke. Not the orange and red of the flames, but a shape, a vertical pillar of absolute dark, moving against the burning backdrop. It didn't flicker, it didn't dance like a shadow cast by firelight. It was solid, dense, absorbing all light around it. It moved with a terrifying grace, the way water flows over a smooth stone, silent despite the roar of the firestorm surrounding us. I had assumed it was a massive, burnt tree trunk falling, but falling trees don't emit that low-frequency resonant sound, a vibration I felt more in my chest than heard with my ears. It was like the deep, sustained note of an enormous bell, muffled by distance and smoke. I started driving back to the site every day, not to investigate for the official record, but for myself. I needed to see where the tracks ended. Henderson had only followed them for maybe 20 feet before protocol forced him to stop. I continued where he left off days later, armed with a small shovel and a growing desperation. The tracks led deeper into the unburnt, sheltered canyons on the eastern ridge, terrain that was rugged, steep, and exactly where a large, intelligent creature would seek refuge from the fire's intensity. It was here, among the ancient juniper and cedar, where the atmosphere shifted completely. The overwhelming smell of smoke dissipated, replaced by that heavy, sweet, musky odor. It wasn't unpleasant exactly. It was raw, organic, like fertile earth mixed with something sweetly metallic, almost like old blood. And the silence, the unnatural, oppressive silence. I walked for hours, marking each enormous footfall. They were consistent, maintaining that impossible 6-foot stride, moving steadily uphill. It wasn't the track of a creature fleeing. It was the track of a creature with a destination, a purpose. And that purpose somehow had involved me. Then I found the spot where the movement stopped. A large, flat shelf of rock perfectly hidden by an overhang. The track stopped right at the edge of the stone. There on the rock was a perfect dark smudge, slightly tacky to the touch. It was not ash. I scraped a sample into a small vial. Later analysis, private off-the-books analysis paid for with my retirement savings, would identify it as a mixture of burnt biological residue, human blood, my own, confirmed by DNA, and strangely, a concentrated amount of unknown non-human primate hair follicles. Unlike anything cataloged in North America, it was on that rock shelf that the full horror of the realization started to coalesce into something concrete. This creature had carried me, not to safety, but to a temporary safe harbor. It had rested, and it had watched. I looked up at the ridge towering above the rock shelf. The juniper branches were thick, but several were snapped cleanly, horizontally, at a height easily 10 feet above the ground. They weren't broken by wind or fire damage. They were snapped with brute, clean force, leaving sharp, white fractures against the dark wood. And in the fine dust settled on the highest snapped branch, I saw it, a single faint fingerprint impression, wide, heavy, with lines that spoke of immense age and a texture that was rough, leathery. I knelt down on the rock shelf, placing my hand flat against the spot where I must have lain weeks earlier. The rock was cold, unforgiving, and I started to shake, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of understanding. The confrontation hadn't been in the fire. The confrontation was now in this silence. The creature hadn't run away immediately after depositing me. It had stayed. It had monitored the fire's retreat, waited for the smoke to clear enough for the rescue teams to operate safely, and only then, in the pre-dawn hours, did it slip away into the upper canyons. Why? Why save a human? Why risk itself in the very heart of the disaster zone? My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic, frantic rhythm in the oppressive stillness. I could feel the presence of the woods around me, no longer benign but ancient, watching. I was back in its territory, standing exactly where it had left me. I closed my eyes, trying desperately to replay the instant before I passed out in the smoke. The immense heat, the scream of the wind, the overwhelming noise, and then the sudden, impossible quiet around me. That brief, desperate instant of contact. I remember thinking, I'm dying now. And then the smell of musk, the pressure, and the singular, terrifying feeling of being looked at, not judged, not preyed upon, but assessed. And the eyes, though I never saw them clearly in the smoke, I felt them. They were powerful, deep, not the glint of a predator, but the gaze of something old, something burdened, something that understood the disaster unfolding. That memory, the feeling of the gaze, was the final breaking point of the official explanation. Animals don't stare with intelligence and empathy. This was something that looked at the human tragedy and made a calculated decision to intervene. This was the moment I stopped hunting for a bear or a hallucination and started tracking a protector, a silent, massive guardian that resided in the deepest, most untouched parts of the burn area, and whose reasons for sparing me were still locked within the ruins of that firestorm. I needed to go higher, deeper into the canyon. I needed to find where the tracks finally ended, and I knew with sickening certainty that where the tracks ended, the creature began. I didn't wake up all at once. It was more like a long, slow climb through heavy static, a white noise machine that sounded like fire chewing on iron. The pain was the first thing to greet me, a hot, searing blanket woven tight across my chest and down my right arm. My lungs felt like cinder sponges soaked in gasoline. Every shallow breath scraped raw tissue. But the air, that was the impossible part. The air I was breathing was still hot, still thick with the residue of 1,000 acres of cremation, but it wasn't choking. It wasn't the suffocating, instantaneous poison that had collapsed my world minutes before. It was air that was survivable. When I managed to roll onto my side, a monumental effort that cost me a guttural, involuntary scream, I saw the line, the precise, stark demarcation between life and death. Behind me, perhaps 30 feet away, the main column of the blaze still roared, a living furnace throwing off such intense heat that the air shimmered and vibrated like a plucked string. It sounded like an oncoming train that never passed. The smoke there was absolute, black, rolling, and impenetrable. In front of me, just ash, gray, fine, deep ash that had been pushed aside, disturbed, molded. I was lying in a small pocket, a cleared depression in the pulverized remnants of what had been timber and earth. I was safe. But the safety was impossible. I forced myself up to a sitting position, every muscle protesting, every joint screaming. I was dazed, certainly, concussed perhaps, dehydrated completely. But I was not burned to a crisp and I was outside the kill zone. How? That's when the memory started to flash, not as a coherent film reel, but as sharp, disconnected photographs. The heat slamming me to the ground, the desperate, futile scramble, the sudden, absolute darkness of the smoke engulfing me, and then the sensation of lift. It wasn't gentle. It was powerful, decisive, and shockingly fast. I remember my head lolling, my chest compressed, my feet dragging, not walking but being hauled, like a child picked up by a frantic parent or a sack of grain tossed over a massive shoulder. I felt the heat of the fire on my exposed skin, but the heat of whatever was holding me was different, deeper, organic, and the scent, the residual smell clinging to my charred uniform wasn't just smoke. Smoke is dry, acrid, metallic, This was something else. Musky, damp, primal. The scent of ancient earth and wet fur mixed with something sweet, almost like rotting apples or fermented berries. It was the smell of the forest floor after a hard rain, but amplified, concentrated, dominating the overwhelming stench of the burn. I looked down at the ground immediately surrounding me. The ash was about 6 inches deep here, pulverized earth and burned wood dust. If I had crawled, there would be drag marks, elbow impressions, perhaps blood trails given the state of my arm. There was none of that, there were only footprints. They started maybe 10 feet from where I lay, right at the edge of the deepest ash pit. They weren't mine. My size 14 boots, even with the weight of my gear, would never have made such deep uniform depressions. These were massive, wide across the ball of the foot, incredibly long, maybe 16 or 17 inches, and crucially, they were pressed down far deeper into the ash than anything human could manage while running, or even walking. A 6-inch layer of fine ash gives way easily. To leave an impression nearly 4 inches deep in that dust, the weight distribution had to be immense. This wasn't a bear. Even the largest grizzly running would leave a chaotic, clawed track. These were distinct, perfectly oval impressions, clearly showing a heel and a broad forefoot, devoid of claws or the familiar segmented padding of a canine. They were, horrifyingly, built for upright walking. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. They marched in a clean, powerful line, heading away from the inferno. And then abruptly, about 4 steps from my location, they stopped. It was as if whatever was carrying me simply set me down and vanished into the smoke, not breaking stride, not stumbling, just ceasing its physical presence. My mind, attempting to cling to some shred of sanity, raced for explanations. A mountain lion? No. The stride was too long, the gait too purposeful, and the pressure far too great. A person. A search and rescue team member who somehow reached me through that firewall. Impossible. No human could navigate that heat, carry me, a 200-pound man in 70 pounds of gear, at that speed, without leaving some sign of strain or struggle. And why would they set me down and disappear without a word? Why wouldn't they wait for backup? The physical evidence defied every rule of physics and physiology I knew. I dragged my eyes up from the tracks, following the direction of the rescue. What I saw next made the hairs on my neck stand up not just from fear, but from a profound, chilling sense of violation. The tracks led to a small cluster of trees, pines and firs, that hadn't been completely consumed, merely scarred and blackened. About 8 feet up, where the lowest branches of the pine should have been, several massive limbs were snapped. Not cleanly burned, not broken by falling debris, but violently snapped at the trunk interface, showing the raw, white wood underneath the char. These were thick branches, the kind you'd need an axe or a chainsaw to fell properly. They were broken with sheer applied leverage, and at a height no normal man, even standing on a rig, could reach. It was as if a powerful upward thrust of movement, a sudden leap or the settling of an immense weight, had clipped them off. It hit me then, the absolute cold certainty. Whatever had rescued me was enormous, immensely strong, and moved with a terrifying economy of motion. It hadn't carried me under its arm. It had probably carried me across its shoulders, or perhaps held me up high against its chest, moving in giant, silent bounds away from the worst of the heat. My fear sharpened into a cold, desperate paranoia. If it had the power to carry me, it had the power to crush me. Why the intervention? Why the choice to save one insignificant, doomed firefighter? The silence began to fray. In the distance, through the ringing in my ears and the constant roar of the far-off fire, I heard the faint, hopeful sound of a helicopter blade cutting through the heavy air. Search and rescue. They were close. A frantic impulse seized me. Hide the tracks. I knew with bone-deep certainty that if I showed those tracks to my crew, to the sheriff, or to the fire chief, the story would instantly pivot from heroic survival to psychiatric break. I didn't care about my reputation. I cared about the truth of what I had felt, what I had survived. If the physical proof was discovered, the world would rationalize it, distort it, or bury it entirely. I tried to stand, intending to use my charred gloves to sweep the ash over the massive footprints, but the effort was too much. The pain in my arm flared and I slumped back, gasping. I could only watch, helpless, as the helicopter sound grew louder, closer. They would see it all. They would have their own interpretation. And then I saw the final piece of evidence, tucked into the roots of a half-burned cedar right next to the largest footprint. It wasn't a biological artifact. It was woven. It was a piece of fabric, dark brown, thick, woven from heavy, natural fibers, unlike anything we used in the service. It was ragged at the edges, perhaps torn by the heat or snagged on the roots. But what made my blood run cold was the context. Clinging to the fibers, barely visible but definitely present, was a strand of hair. It was impossibly thick, coarse, reddish-brown, almost the color of oxidized copper. It was perhaps 4 inches long, and when I carefully picked it up, ignoring the pain, it felt stiff and resilient, like fine copper wire. It had none of the characteristics of bear fur, nor the fine, oily texture of human hair. I closed my hand around the strand and the swatch of fabric. These were my secrets now. This was the silent, physical contradiction to whatever official report would soon be written about Sergeant O'Connell's miraculous escape. The air crackled again, not just with the impending helicopter, but with the sudden, sharp scent of ozone, often associated with intense electrical discharge or perhaps something very large moving very quickly through the air. The musk smell, the ancient, damp scent, was gone, erased completely by the approaching noise of man and machine. I straightened my face, forcing the adrenaline down, trying to adopt the look of a man who had simply survived due to luck and training, not supernatural intervention. I needed to appear coherent even if inside my entire perception of the natural world had been vaporized. The helicopter appeared over the ridge, a loud, beating intrusion into the desolate silence, kicking up dust and ash. Immediately behind it, I heard the crunching sounds of boots and the mechanical whine of a heavy-duty brush truck. The ground search teams had broken through the perimeter. I waited for them, the copper-colored hair sample clutched tight in my palm, scorching a perfect imprint into my skin. I knew they would find me, assess my wounds, and begin asking questions. And I knew exactly what I would tell them. I would tell them the truth about the fire, about the collapse, and about the last moment I remembered. But I would omit the tracks, the broken branches, and the overpowering sense of being lifted and carried by something fundamentally non-human. Because if I spoke that truth, they wouldn't just question my survival, they would question my sanity. And worse, they would descend on this burn site like vultures, looking for the physical proof I was trying to protect, trying to understand. I needed time to process the sheer impossibility of the rescue, and time to understand why. Why risk the fire? Why carry me out? And why leave me with the silent, terrifying question, what are you? The first man who reached me was Captain Miller, his face blackened with soot and drawn tight with exhaustion and relief. He knelt beside me, shouting over the rotors, "O'Connell, Jesus, man, we thought you were gone. What happened? Did you crawl out? How did you get this far?" I looked him straight in the eyes, the lie already forming in my throat, thick and heavy like the ash. I felt the sharp edges of the secret digging into my palm. "I don't know, Captain," I said, my voice barely a rasp. "The smoke just took me. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was here. I must have just pushed through." It was a lie that hinged on a medical impossibility, the ability to run blind through a flash fire after acute smoke inhalation. But it was the only palatable story, the only survival narrative the world would accept. Captain Miller looked around the small, clear pocket where I lay, then back towards the still raging fire. He frowned, a deep, professional furrow in his brow. He didn't question my words immediately, but his eyes lingered on the strangely cleared ash around me. He was searching for drag marks, for a clue that made sense. "Well, thank God, son. You're a damn miracle," he muttered, pulling the radio closer to his mouth. "We have Sergeant O'Connell, alive. Location secure. We need medevac. Urgent." But the miracle wasn't mine. It belonged to whatever had stepped out of the ancient woods, ignored the natural law of the inferno, and carried me to safety before dissolving back into the smoke and the shadows. And I knew then, as the stretcher-bearers moved in, that my life as I knew it, the straightforward fire and rescue existence, was over. I had been touched by the wilderness in a way that couldn't be quantified, classified, or controlled. My survival was not a story of human grit. It was a debt owed to an impossibility, a debt I didn't yet know how to repay. And as they loaded me onto the chopper, the first wave of forensic specialists arrived, stepping gingerly around the perimeter. I prayed the wind had already scattered the deepest footprints. I prayed the darkness hadn't allowed them to spot the strangely broken branches overhead. The official narrative was about to begin, and I had already chosen my role, the traumatized survivor who couldn't quite remember the details. The alternative, the truth I held tightly in my burning hand, was simply too monstrous for the world to bear. The mask was useless now. The air filter, choked with ash and burning particulate, had surrendered hours ago. It wasn't just the lack of oxygen that was killing me. It was the sheer heat, the pressure of the fire roaring around me like a sentient thing determined to crush the air from my lungs. I remember the sound best. A grinding, perpetual hurricane that swallowed every other noise, the crack of falling trees, the shriek of metal, even the ragged sound of my own despairing breaths. I had crawled perhaps 20 yards from where the engine finally gave out. But 20 yards in that kind of inferno is nothing. It's like sinking deeper into the quicksand. My radio was dead, my crew was gone, and my training dissolved into a useless mantra. Stay low, stay wet, stay clear. None of it mattered anymore. The world had narrowed down to a blinding, scorching tunnel of red and black. I closed my eyes, less to block the light and more to try and find the sanity that was slipping away with every shallow inhale. This was it, the last moment. I felt the strange, almost comforting weight of failure settling over me. Guilt, too, a raw, burning acid in my stomach. The faces of the rookies, the final desperate plea for backup that never came. All of it was turning to smoke. But then the fire changed. Not the fire itself. The roar remained constant, the heat unwavering, but the space immediately around me fractured. It was a sensory shock so profound it momentarily eclipsed the pain of being burned alive. The thick, musky odor I had first caught a trace of near the ridge, that scent of wet fur, ozone, and sweet rotten fruit, suddenly intensified, overwhelming the charcoal and diesel. It was dense, suffocating in its own right, but beneath the horror of its alienness there was a momentary, impossible cooling. It felt as though a refrigerator door had opened right beside me, drawing a sharp, distinct line between the catastrophic heat of the wildfire and the presence of something utterly cold and massive. I wasn't moving, but the ground was. The earth beneath my chest shuddered, not with the tremor of a falling tree, but with the measured, heavy impact of something walking. And this walking was unnatural, too rhythmic to be a distressed animal, too controlled to be random. It was a tread that suggested density, mass, and a horrifying degree of intention. I tried to shout, but my throat was useless, rasping out only a pathetic whistle. I squeezed my eyes open, spitting out grit and trying to clear the mucus caked across my cornea. Through the watery, blurring vision, I saw only shapes, the dancing, predatory orange of the flames, and then, closer, a wall of pure, dark shadow. It was impossibly dark. In that environment, where the firelight painted everything a brutal shade of crimson and gold, this presence absorbed the light. It didn't reflect. It simply wasn't illuminated. It was a moving void, impossibly high, yet somehow crouching low over me. The next sensation wasn't a push or a shove. It was the feeling of being grasped. It didn't use fingers to pick me up, not in the human sense. It was the encompassing grip of a massive, flat palm and 4 thick, powerful digits wrapping around my torso and the remains of my Nomex jacket. The force was tremendous, yet perfectly calibrated. It didn't crush my ribs, though it could have snapped me in half with a casual squeeze. Instead, the grip was firm, supportive, and utterly non-negotiable. I was lifted from the ground as if I weighed no more than a child's discarded rag doll. My mind, already shattered by smoke inhalation and terror, screamed. I thrashed weakly, instinct overriding reason. I tried to claw at whatever held me, but my fingers found only an incredibly thick, coarse texture, not hair exactly, or perhaps hair so densely packed and matted that it felt like tough, damp hide mixed with old leather and tree bark. It was warm, surprisingly, despite the aura of cold that had preceded it, a deep, living warmth that radiated muscle and immense physical energy. We started moving, and the speed was horrifying. I had spent my life studying the topography of this forest, the dense underbrush, the hidden ravines, the treacherous footing. No human, weighted down by fire gear and carrying an unconscious man, could navigate that terrain at this velocity, especially not while the ground was actively burning. The world became a nauseating blur of black smoke and streaking red light. I felt the air pressure shift violently as we smashed through stands of thick chaparral that should have stopped any normal pursuit dead. The branches didn't just bend. They snapped with sharp reports that were swallowed instantly by the surrounding inferno. This creature didn't move around obstacles. It moved through them. My head flopped back against what I realized was a chest or shoulder, massive and hard as granite. Every jarring step resonated through my body, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate my teeth loose. And then, the sound came. It wasn't a roar directed at the fire, and it certainly wasn't a scream of pain. It was a guttural sound of deep effort, or perhaps even a deep, unhappy command. A powerful, rumbling resonance that originated in the throat and chest of the carrier. It was the closest thing to speech I had ever heard in the wild, yet it lacked any discernible language. It was just sheer, ancient tone, a vibration that spoke volumes about imposition and seniority. It was the sound of something deeply, intensely annoyed, that it had to exert itself in this manner. I struggled again, trying to regain some modicum of control, some sense of professional dignity even in my final moments. I need to see it. I need to know what's taking me. My helmet had been lost in the initial collapse, but the hardened fabric of my hood and collar shielded some of the grit. I forced my head to turn slightly, resisting the momentum of the creature's stride. Through the haze of tears and smoke, I finally managed a partial, terrifying glimpse. It wasn't the face, not yet. That was hidden high above me in the smoke layer. What I saw was the arm that wasn't holding me, the opposite limb swinging with powerful, fluid ease as it navigated the destruction. It was immense, thicker than my torso, covered in that dark, thick layer that absorbed the light. The muscle definition was breathtaking, a testament to raw, inherited power. But what chilled me to the core was the realization of the hand. The free hand occasionally brushed against the burning debris, quickly swatting aside a flaming piece of pine, or shielding its own massive body from a particularly aggressive tongue of flame. The digits were long and broad, tipped not with claws, but with flat, thick nails, almost like human nails, but weathered and dark as slate. And as that hand moved, something happened that defied every law of physics and firefighting I knew. When its massive shadow fell across the burning undergrowth, the small flames there seemed to shrink, to falter, as if intimidated. Whether this was a trick of the smoke, a change in airflow caused by its movement, or something else entirely I couldn't say. But for a flicker of a second, I entertained the insane notion that this thing was not merely enduring the fire, it was asserting dominance over it. The fear transitioned from the terror of imminent death to the existential dread of fundamental reality shattering. Fire was elemental. It answered to nothing. Yet here I was, being carried by something that moved through an inferno with the calculated ease of a man walking through a light rain. I remember my tongue tasting like stale metal and fear. I fought the urge to pass out, knowing that once I surrendered consciousness, I would truly belong to whatever this was. I had to catalog this, I had to remember. Even if it was the last thing I ever did, the truth needed a witness. We ran for what felt like an eternity, though logic suggests it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. 10 minutes where my life was entirely dependent on the motive and good grace of a biological impossibility. The trajectory was strange. We weren't heading back towards the known fire breaks or the access road where the command post should have been. We were heading deeper into the rougher terrain, moving perpendicular to the main body of the blaze, towards a section of the forest that was historically less dense, closer to the high, rocky ridges that formed the spine of the mountain range. It was a path of avoidance, a path only known intimately by something that considered the entire mountain range its backyard. Then, gradually, the relentless, suffocating pressure of the smoke began to thin. The visibility improved, shifting from a painful 5 feet to maybe 20. I could see the outlines of the ancient ponderosas now, their massive trunks scorched but still standing, marking the edges of the active burn zone. The creature didn't slow down, but the pace changed slightly, less panicked urgency, more calculated speed. It was here, in this marginal zone between active fire and deep forest, that I felt the massive arm tighten its grip one last time, shifting my weight. I fought the vertigo, lifted my head again, and managed to look forward, beyond the immense shoulder of my captor. The creature's head was still angled slightly away from me, focused entirely on the path ahead. But because of the sudden, relative clarity, I could finally make out the profile, the sheer verticality of its form, the powerful thick neck. It was colossal, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, and its musculature was terrifyingly efficient. It moved with a grace that was entirely inconsistent with its bulk. My focus then dropped, pulled by something resting in the crook of the creature's other arm, the one that wasn't carrying me. It wasn't empty. Before I could process the meaning of that second item, a flash of red light from the still active fire line painted the creature's side, and I caught a horrifying, undeniable detail. Embedded deeply in the thick hide of its upper arm, just below the shoulder, was a piece of shrapnel, a jagged metallic edge, perhaps from the engine's exploded transmission housing or a fractured water tank. It was buried deep, drawing a slow, black seepage that looked more like oil than blood. This thing wasn't immune to injury. It was hurt, badly, and yet it was running through fire, carrying me, a panicked, smoke-addled human, to safety. Why? The question hammered against the inside of my skull, a rhythm accompanying the sound of its massive feet pounding the earth. Why risk injury? Why exert this colossal effort? Why intervene in a disaster that should have been purely human? The momentum suddenly shifted one final time. We were coming to a stop. I felt the ground rising to meet me, but gently. The massive, flat hand unwrapped from my torso, carefully lowering me onto a patch of damp, unburned earth, sheltered beneath a colossal, unyielding rock overhang. The change in altitude was shocking. The air here was clean, crisp, and cold. I gasped, sucking in the blessed oxygen, coughing violently as my lungs reacted to the sudden purity. I was safe from the fire, but I was terrifyingly exposed to my rescuer. I lay there, utterly helpless, the creature standing over me, its sheer size blotting out the sky. I could hear its breathing now, deep and labored, a heavy rhythmic sound like a bellows pumping ancient hot air. I forced myself onto my elbow, trying to look up, bracing myself for the moment of confrontation. This was where the debt would be called in. This was where the motive would be revealed. Was I saved only to be consumed? Was this some strange game of preservation? My eyes traveled up the column of its body, past the powerful shoulders, the thickly muscled neck, until they finally landed on the head. It tilted slightly, observing me. The smoke was gone now, replaced by the clean, sharp light filtering from the dark forest canopy above the rock shelf. I saw the face clearly, the shape of the brow, the heavy, intelligent structure of the jaw, the flatness of the nose. Humanoid, profoundly ancient, yet utterly alien. But it was the eyes that stopped my heart. Not glowing, not monstrous, but deep-set, dark, and filled with an unbearable depth of emotion, pity, weariness, and something else. Something I recognized from my own darkest moments. Pure, unadulterated pain. The same agony I had glimpsed in the dark seepage on its arm. As I stared, frozen between gratitude and paralyzing fear, those eyes locked onto mine. And for the briefest, most terrifying moment of my life, I understood exactly what it wanted. Not through language, not through telepathy, but through an ancient, crushing weight of silent communication. You should not be here. This place is not for you. And then, as a final punctuation, it raised its free hand, the one that was not injured, and pointed one thick, unwavering finger directly past my head, towards the trail leading away from the fire. Go. The communication was clear, absolute, and backed by the unquestionable authority of the mountain itself. But before I could obey, before I could even gather the strength to crawl, I looked back down at the object resting in the crook of its other arm, the one I had glimpsed moments earlier. It wasn't a log. It wasn't a bundle of gear. It was a young woman, maybe 20 years old. Her face was pale, covered in smudges of dirt, her clothes torn, but her chest was rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. She was unconscious, but alive. A hiker, perhaps, or a camper, trapped in the path of the fire. The creature had carried two of us, 2 lives, pulled from the heart of the conflagration, preserved in the colossal strength of this entity that should not exist. Its gaze, still locked on mine, shifted slightly to the figure in its arms. There was an intimacy there, a protective fierceness that transcended mere animal instinct. I watched, numb with shock, as the creature gently positioned the unconscious woman against the base of the rock shelf, laying her down with a tenderness that defied its horrific power. It stepped back, its gaze snapping back to me, the pain in its eyes intensifying, a warning now overriding the exhaustion. The low rumble returned, vibrating against the rock shelf, a deep, cautionary sound. It pointed its finger at the woman, then back at the exit trail, and then, slowly, deliberately, at the jagged piece of metal buried in its own massive bicep. I understood. I understood far more than my traumatized mind could process. It was hurt. It had saved her. It had saved me. And now, its resources were depleted. It needed to disappear, and it needed me to take care of the other survivor. The sheer scale of this intervention, the planning, the motive, it was overwhelming. This wasn't some random wilderness encounter. This was a calculated act of rescue performed by an ancient intelligence under extreme duress. I tried to whisper a thank you, tried to lift my hand in acknowledgement, but the entity didn't wait. It turned its huge frame with surprising suddenness, dissolving back into the rising smoke plumes, moving towards the deeper, unburned sanctuary of the ridgeline. It moved not like a fleeing beast, but like a weary sentinel returning to its post. I heard the heavy steps recede, the sound swallowed by the distance and the persistent roar of the fire still eating the valley below. And then, there was only silence. Absolute, oppressive silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the faint, shallow breaths of the unconscious girl lying beside me. I was left alone, physically intact, sitting on the cold, hard earth, staring at the empty space where the creature had stood, and realizing with cold, terrifying certainty that I now held a truth too immense and too dangerous to ever share with the world, a truth that had been carved directly into my shattered memory by a massive, benevolent shadow. The weight of that knowledge settled onto my shoulders, heavier than any smoke-filled bunker gear, heavier than the failure and the guilt. I was alive, but I was also forever changed, a debtor to the impossible. My gaze fell to the young woman, and I knew what I had to do. The creature had played its part. Now, I had to play mine. I had to concoct a story that the world could swallow, a tale of survival that omitted the only true and terrifying detail, that I had been carried out of hell by a wounded god. The moment the immense, crushing pressure enveloped me, the world outside the smoke ceased to exist. All sound, the roaring inferno, the snapping timber, the frantic beat of my own ruined heart, was muted, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence deep within my ears, the sound of blood rushing, or perhaps the deep, ancient hum of the earth itself preparing to swallow me whole. I was no longer an active participant in my survival. I was cargo, I was a burden being carried by something that moved with a terrifying economy of motion. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment the bear drags me off to finish the job. But it wasn't the clumsy, powerful lurch of a wounded grizzly, nor the purposeful, efficient grip of a search and rescue team. This movement was fluid, impossibly quiet, and utterly relentless. It defied the terrain. We were moving across ground that I knew, intellectually, was littered with smoldering logs, treacherous holes left by burned-out root systems, and razor-sharp shrapnel of igneous rock exploding from the heat. Yet, there was no stumble, no hesitation, no shift in balance that betrayed effort. It felt like floating, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thump of its enormous feet hitting the earth, a sound so padded and controlled that it seemed to absorb all vibration, releasing only a deep, subsonic resonance. My right side, the side where the thick, rough hair brushed against my ruined coat, was screaming with pain. But even the pain felt secondary, overshadowed by the sheer, paralyzing confusion of the circumstance. My visor was gone, my face shield melted, and the smoke, thick and oily, burned my corneas. I forced my eyelids open, trying to register a shape, any defining contour, but the air was a blinding ochre haze, lit only sporadically by the brief, terrifying flares of pressurized gases escaping the ground nearby. All I could discern was the overwhelming scale of the thing holding me. It was colossal. My head, lolling slightly, only came up to what I estimated must be its mid-chest or lower shoulder blade. The heat radiating from the burning forest was intense enough to blister paint, but the heat emanating from the creature itself was different. It wasn't the searing heat of combustion. It was a deep, biological warmth, almost furnace-like, yet somehow damp, like standing near a massive, steaming mammal that had just risen from a cold river. And the scent. God, the scent. That was the real anchor of the experience. The detail that prevented my mind from classifying the entire episode as a fevered hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning. It was a complex, overwhelming, olfactory cocktail. The primary note was the sharp, acrid ozone of the fire, the stench of consumed chemicals and plastic, but beneath that, layering over it, was the creature's own specific signature. It was musk, yes, heavy and primal, like wet dog fur left in the sun for weeks, but intertwined with something else. Something distinctly herbal, almost sweet, like crushed cedar and decayed fermenting fruit. And cutting through it all was a profound mineral element, the smell of ancient earth and rock dust, an odor that spoke not merely of the woods, but of the deep substrata of the world, untouched by human civilization. I remember my lips moving, trying to form Tom's name. Tom. Tom, are you there? But all that emerged was a useless, rattling cough, a strangled sound that was immediately swallowed by the density of the air. If the creature heard me, it gave no indication. Its pace remained measured, unstoppable. The guilt, even then, was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, heavier than the fire gear. Why me? Why was this impossible ancient thing expending this profound effort to save me, the man who had failed to save his partner? Every stride it took was a step further away from where I knew Tom must be, somewhere back in the hellish heart of the firebreak, slumped against the bulldozer, waiting for a relief that would never come. I tried to fight briefly. A residual, desperate flicker of survival instinct kicked in. I lifted one of my arms, the elbow searing against the creature's massive flank, and tried to push away, to stop the movement, to force it to turn back. We have to go back. The response was not violence, but merely an assertion of overwhelming power. The grip on my torso, which had been firm but not painful, tightened just enough to immobilize me completely. It was a warning shot, fired not from malice, but from pure, indifferent necessity. It wasn't squeezing to hurt me. It was squeezing to make me understand that my struggle was futile, that my destination was not currently negotiable. It was during this brief, desperate resistance that I managed the clearest view yet, a terrifying fraction of a second when the wind shifted, clearing a momentary corridor through the smoke. I saw only its neck and shoulder. The hair was not black, not uniformly brown. It was a mosaic, deep rust, charcoal gray, and strands of almost silver white, matted in places, thick enough to deflect minor sparks. The musculature beneath was staggering, moving like steel cables under a rough textile, flexing and rotating with the effortless power of an old-growth tree swaying in a minor breeze. And then, just as quickly, the smoke closed in again, trapping me once more in the stifling, musky darkness. I surrendered then, not to death, but to the reality that my life was momentarily ceded to an entity that existed entirely outside the boundaries of my rational, operational world. I focused on the mechanical details, trying to log them, knowing that if I survived, no one would believe them, but needing to cling to them anyway. We descended a slope that I hadn't realized was there, a sharp, rocky gradient that should have required careful footing and ropes. For this carrier, it was nothing. I felt the ground momentarily drop away, and then the controlled counterweight as it leaned into the descent, using its immense mass not as an impedance, but as an inertial dampener. The air began to change. Subtly, slowly, the acrid bite lessened. The roar of the central fire, which had been a constant, oppressive curtain of sound, began to recede into a low, menacing growl. We were definitely moving away from the hot zone, pushing toward the outer perimeter where the fire breaks held. My mind, freed momentarily from the immediate sensory shock, began to cycle back to the only thing it could process: the impossibility of this rescue. Firefighters are trained to navigate the smoke, to use hands and feet, following the sound or the heat signature. But this creature? It navigated by some internal GPS, some inherent genetic map of the terrain that mocked human instruments. It knew exactly where the safe routes were, the gaps in the blaze, the sheltered ravines. It moved with the knowledge of centuries. It was not running haphazardly. It was executing a calculated escape route that was probably centuries old, perfected through countless cycles of forest burning and renewal. It was moving us to safety, but it was moving us, me, along its path, following its imperative. We traveled for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it could have been only 10 minutes. 10 minutes spent in the suffocating embrace of the impossible. The journey was marked by a series of minor critical thresholds. First, the reduction of the intense immediate heat. Second, the thinning of the darkest, blackest smoke, replaced now by a grayish, less lethal haze. And finally, the sound of the wind, real wind, shifting through,